In the meantime, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Rod Fry, who's with us all the way from Mexico. So he's one of our ministry partners. It's been a ministry partner with us for a while, and he's here. He's going to be delivering the message for us. So please welcome Rod. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here. Some of you may have expected Kirk to be here. Kirk is, I'm not Kirk. Kirk is taller than I am, much more articulate, better looking, and he runs. I do not run. I only run when I'm chased by something that I want to get away from, and not very long and for not very far. But Kirk is also taste challenged right now. You might imagine what that means, and so we happen to be in the area. We're going back to Mexico City on Thursday, my wife and I, and so I was happy to fill in. I usually preach in Spanish, so if I forget some words, please understand. I want to start by seeing some pictures of this past summer, actually. As a matter of fact, 3 of the 5 people on the stage were down with us in Mexico in the beginning of August. And I want you, as you see these pictures, to figure out what's a common denominator, okay? Because that has to do with some of the theme of our sermon today. We did a lot of this in Mexico. Matter of fact, while we watch these pictures, just want to throw out another advertisement. I've talked to a number of you, high school seniors, those who will be 18 next summer, to think about an internship. So I was talking to Andrew, and I was trying to get a hold of Haley, which I see down here, and talking to Naomi. And so have you figured out what the common theme there is? Yeah, food, right. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. If you want to turn in your Bibles or your cell phones to Luke 19, and this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and it's where Jesus visits a man by the name of Zacchaeus, that wee little man, right? And a little bit of context here. Mark 10:32 says, and it's the same parallel passage, they were on their way up to Jerusalem. So Jesus, this is the week before the Passion Week. This is the week before Jesus begins that final week of his life that ends Friday in his crucifixion and then the resurrection the following Sunday. It says in Mark 10:32, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Now, why would they be astonished, and why would they be afraid? Isaiah 50, verse 7, talks about the suffering servant, or the servant of the Lord. In this context, and it says he set his face like flint. There was something in Jesus' face as he was going up to Jerusalem, realizing that this was the last week of his life. Can you imagine all that was going through Jesus' mind? And his face probably looked different, reflecting that conviction that he had, and obviously the anticipation of all that he was going to go through. In John 11, if you remember that passage, we see that Jesus heals Lazarus, and that was like the final straw for the Pharisees. Matter of fact, the text says that they wanted to kill Lazarus again. It's like, how many times does a guy have to die, right? And they also wanted to kill Jesus, and they really were even more determined after the resurrection of Lazarus in John 11. And in that passage, in John 11:53 and 54, it says, so on that day they plotted to take his life. Therefore Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. So, in the next slide, we see kind of a map. Is there a map in one of these slides, I think, as we kind of see geographically where Ephraim is? Jesus begins to move towards Jericho. Jericho is a gateway city. You almost have to go through Jericho to get to Jerusalem. So Jesus, after the resurrection of Lazarus, he knows that the end is near. He knows that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, want more than ever to kill him. And so he's on the way to Jerusalem. And in that context, he passes through Jericho. And in chapter 9 of Luke, he heals Bartimaeus. You perhaps remember that story. And here we are in chapter 11. So Jesus is headed towards the cross. And we also find in the book of Luke that Jesus really enjoyed a good meal. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you look at the book of Luke, and we're not going to take the time to go through it chapter by chapter, you're just going to have to believe me on this. But in Luke 5, Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners at the home of Levi. In Luke 7, he's anointed at the house of Simon the Pharisee during a meal. In Luke 9, he feeds the 5,000. In Luke 10, he's eating at the home of Martha and Mary. In Luke 11, he condemns the Pharisees and the teachers of the law at a meal. At 14, he urges people to invite the poor to their meals rather than just their friends. In Luke 19, where we are now, he invites himself to dinner with Lazarus. In chapter 22, we have the Last Supper, a very special time that Jesus spent with his disciples. And even after his resurrection in Luke 24, he eats fish, right, with his disciples. So if you are aspiring to be a disciple of Jesus, I have good news for you. You really need to go out and buy a gas grill. Jesus ate a lot. Matter of fact, some commentators say that the book of Luke can be summarized from Jesus either coming from or going to a meal. And here we see in this context, in Luke 19, that he invites himself to the house of Zacchaeus. Jesus was known to enjoy eating and drinking. Matter of fact, that was one of the criticisms, right, of Jesus, that John the Baptist came fasting and you know, in the more typical religious cut of the day, but you've come and they accused Jesus of being a glutton, and Jesus wasn't a glutton, but they weren't used to somebody coming and feasting, and Jesus said, how can we fast when the bridegroom, does anybody fast at a wedding, right? No, it's a time of celebration. There will come a time, he says, when my disciples will fast, but it's not now. In Luke 9, John the Baptist came, John 9:33, John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. In Luke 16, and we know a lot of the parables of Luke 16, Jesus tells 3 parables. Do you remember what they are? The parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost son, right? The prodigal son. It's interesting in the Gospels that Jesus oftentimes tells parables, and then the text actually leads us to a real-life illustration of the parable. And we kind of have that here. Jesus tells a parable about the lost son, and then in a couple chapters later, in Luke 19, we see a lost son of Israel, Zacchaeus. Luke 15, 1 and 2 says, Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And guess what? They were right. So let's go to our text, verse 1 of Luke 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Us short people can identify with that, right? So Zacchaeus spies on Jesus, right? He wanted to see who Jesus was. Zacchaeus is hearing, and this is at the very end of Jesus' ministry, so for 3.5 years, Zacchaeus is hearing the rumors of Jesus, right? That Jesus actually doesn't reject people like him, that Jesus maybe actually seeks out people like him, and maybe, just maybe, the rumor was true, but he doesn't want to necessarily meet Jesus. He just wants to see Jesus from a distance. So he ran ahead, he climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Verse 4. And the next slide, I think, is an actual picture of what could be. It sits in Jerusalem, the tree, right? Of course, in Jerusalem, they put fences around everything that could be, right? So, but let's suppose that this is true. So Zacchaeus is climbing up there in that tree. I don't know how he got up the first part, but anyway. And he's watching, he's spying on Jesus. Most people don't look up, by the way. Did you ever notice that? But Jesus does, right? Now, Zacchaeus is certainly not on the list of the most likely to believe, but he just can't stay away. Jesus is that irresistibly winsome person. You know, in Mexico, we're going through Exodus, and it was my turn to teach through the passages surrounding the sermon on the Mount Sinai. When you study a lot of the Old Testament, and when you see how much distance God put between he and himself and his people. I mean, if a person or even an animal came close to Mount Sinai, they were going to die, right? And so you have Jews coming out of the law that put a lot of distance between God and his people. Now, there were reasons for that, because God wanted to teach his people that he was holy, right? But there was all kinds of reasons that you could be placed outside of the camp. Some of them very common reasons that you would become unclean. But all of a sudden, Jesus comes, God in the flesh. Remember, Jesus is God. Would you expect God to seek out people like Zacchaeus or people like you or me? Maybe not. But we were wrong, because he did. Zacchaeus says, I heard the rumors, let's just see what he looks like. And we think we're spying on God, but he's really spying on us, isn't he? Zacchaeus, the most unlikely of table companions to sit with God incarnate. Zacchaeus, the most notorious and disagreeable fellow in the whole city, because he was. Everybody hated him. Think about a person you know like that. Don't think too long, or it would be sin, right? But, think about somebody that maybe you know like that. Well, that's the kind of people that Jesus came to reach. Francis Thompson wrote a haunting poem about Jesus tracking us down. It's called The Hound of Heaven, and I'll read the first 15 lines. And it's kind of old English, but I think you'll appreciate it. It says, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinth ways of my own mind, and in the mist of tears, I hid from him, and under running laughter of misted hopes I sped, and shot precipitated adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears from those strong feet that followed after. But with unhurrying chase, an unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and a voice beat, the more instant than the feet, all things betray thee who betrayest me. The hound of heaven. God pursues us, doesn't he? So Jesus surprises Zacchaeus. Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. Verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now, the title of this sermon is Good Food, Great Atmosphere, right? You've gone to restaurants like that, right? The food, food's good, but the atmosphere, just wonderful. Well, this is a case like that. You know, the food, I'm sure Zacchaeus had the best food he could get, because this was an honor that a rabbi would stay at his house. But the atmosphere, even better. When Jesus says, I must stay at your house today, he was saying, I'm going to spend the night. And some translations use the word, I'm going to abide with you. The concept here is that he was going to lodge with, he was going to stay with Zacchaeus. Now remember, Jesus is a week from the cross on this day. And his face was set like flint. He was determined. So let's not think that this was just an accident or an afterthought with Jesus. No, this was his intention. This was why he passed through Jericho. This was his plan, to stay with the biggest scoundrel in the city. Wow. Jumping ahead, the last verse of this passage, verse 10, Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. Probably the key verse in the book of Luke, right? It was important. Jesus spent one of the last 8 days of his life at this guy's house. What would you do if you had 1 week to live? Would you try to get in touch with that neighbor who hasn't talked to you in 20 years, that parks his car in front of your car, takes your space? His dog comes and poops on your yard. Would you go over to that guy if you had 1 week to live? Of all the homes in Jericho, of all the homes of more respectable people, Jesus picked this guy. Everyone knew that his house was built on corruption, on fraud. Everyone knew that a scoundrel lived there, somebody who had ripped them off. Staying with people is magical, isn't it? It's kind of funny because whenever we receive guests, whenever you come to visit us in Mexico, we always put you in Mexican homes. And it's a challenging time because if you don't know, how to speak Spanish, or, by the way, does alguien aquí habla español? Yes, so right, look at there, a couple of you. Or if you don't like mountains of papaya for breakfast, it can be a challenging time. But oftentimes when we're invited here in the States to a church, guess what? We always get sent to a hotel. Now I think probably the motive for that is they think, well, you've traveled or whatever, and you want to stay in a hotel, right? Because you have more privacy, because privacy is a really high value in our society, right? By the way, it's not in most of the rest of the world. That privacy, that personal space, it's considered selfish in most of the rest of the world, but I digress. Hospitality, right? Staying with somebody. Neat things happen when that happens. And so Jesus stays with him. And what's the response of the crowd? Verse 7. All the people saw this and began to mutter. Don't you love that word? Onomatopoeia, is that what it is? Mutter. They're going to mutter. Mutter sounds like muttering. He is going to be a guest of a sinner. It reminds us of Luke 15. Luke 15, 1 and 2. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teacher of the law, what did they do? They muttered. Mutter. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And they are indeed like the older brother, aren't they? Jesus talked about them a couple chapters before. The older brother who judges and criticizes and condemns, right? Dwayne Elmer, in a book that I really like called CrossCultural Servanthood, says this: Jesus, the holy, righteous Son of God, eats with sinners, the despised and rejected, unheard of for anyone concerned with their reputation. To sit and eat with another person indicated oneness with them, solidarity and acceptance, a very countercultural act for Jesus in the Middle Eastern world. Okay, a quick question. Do we have a sort of moral code, certain expectations for people when they come to church, perhaps, or when they come to our house, perhaps? Do we sort of expect that their marriages are okay, that their kids are sort of okay, that they're not doing drugs, that they're not ex-cons, that they're not sexually immoral, that they don't have addiction problems, that they're not dealing with gender issues? Do we kind of feel that way, that, we want kind of those kind of people with us, or we want those kind of people that aren't a hot mess in our church? It's really easy, right, to feel that way. In the book called A Meal with Jesus, Tim Chester says this: Luke seems to pick stories involving tax collectors and prostitutes. They exemplify notorious sinners. It's as if he's testing us. Have we grasped God's grace? How do we react when a promiscuous woman kisses the body of Jesus? Do we celebrate God's grace, or are we scandalized? The grace of God turns out to be uncomfortable and embarrassing. Jesus is socially disruptive. His radical grace disrupts social situations, and we don't like the church to be disrupted. We regard marginalized people in the church as a problem to be handled. Is that true? In other words, do we mutter sometimes? Mutter? Do we mutter? Mutter. To which Jesus would reply, I haven't come for the healthy. Or to those who think they're healthy, I've come for the what? The sick. Yes, I will change them without a doubt, but I will meet people where they are. So when we are tempted, so subtly tempted to believe that somehow we are better than others because we are Christians, or that somehow we deserve God's grace, we probably should remember the kinds of people that, according to 1 Corinthians, God chooses, right? What kind of people does God choose? He chooses the weak, the vile, the people that are not the common people, people with issues, right? That's us. And although we may be redeemed by God's grace, we still struggle with sin, don't we? Anybody here not? And that should be enough to keep us humble. So keeping people at arm's length until they change isn't a great way to reach anybody, is it? Some of us maybe grew up in churches like that, It's like, well, I'm not going to really relate to you until you change and become like me. And so it's kind of hard to embrace people when you're keeping them at arm's length. And by the way, please don't misunderstand me. I think this church is incredibly loving and embracing. And I haven't been here enough to really know, right? But you seem like a great group to me. Please don't take this as a criticism, but we can always grow in these areas, right? So what happens next? Verse 8. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So Jesus transforms his life. The Bible doesn't tell us, but I really feel like Zacchaeus was at the cross a week later. Zacchaeus was probably near the cross saying, how could this happen? So what can we take from this passage? And as we think, and one of the things that as groups visit us in Mexico, one of the things that almost always comes to the forefront, and as we talk about it as a group, is the hospitality of Mexicans, and they'll welcome you into their home, and even when you visit them, they'll send their little kid out for a 3-liter bottle of Coca-Cola. It's better Coke down there, by the way, real sugar, and they'll it's impossible to do anything quickly in Mexico because you're always having to talk to people. I mean, it's crazy. But how hospitable are we? Again, that's the great thing about being a guest speaker. I don't know anybody, right? So I can just ask questions. How hospitable are we? Again, a quote from Tim Chester talking about Jesus. His mission strategy was a long meal stretching into the evening. He did evangelism and discipleship around a table with some grilled fish, a loaf of bread, and a pitcher of wine. Can we do that? For Jesus' feast was not just a metaphor for the kingdom. As Jesus announced the feast of the kingdom, he also brought into reality through his own feasting. Unlike many theologians, he did not come preaching an ideology, promoting ideas, or teaching moral maxims. He came teaching about the feast of the kingdom, and he came feasting in the kingdom. Jesus did not go around merely talking about eating and drinking. He went around eating and drinking a lot. As we live in a culture that's increasingly aggressively negative towards the church, and we live in a society that it's very difficult for people to come and visit a church, an actual building. One of the phenomenal assets that we still all have is our home, our table. I know that because I grew up here, and I have the pounds to prove it, right, that you all know how to cook. And some of the things that you make. I think my mother for Tuesday night is preparing chicken pot pie. With the big thick pieces of dough, the saffron. Not chicken pie. Chicken pie, for those that don't know, has the crust on top, right? That's good. But chicken pot pie, in my humble opinion, is even better. Can you make a good meal? We have a house here in Elizabethtown that we come back to. My kids live there, and I know how hard it is. I've been trying to reach our neighbor. His name's Keith, and it's hard to even talk to your neighbor, isn't it? But there's got to be a way, right? There's got to be a way to get to know our neighbors. And I finally connected with him last year talking about hunting, and that was it, right? And so now at least I know where to start. But what about a good meal with a neighbor? There are certain families here, I'm sure, that are really good at doing this. Hebrews 13:1 and 2 says, "Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." So you never know who the angels are, right? We've hosted, this past summer, we had 68 people visiting us in Mexico. Now, they weren't all in our house, right? And we don't know who the angels are. We're fairly convinced who some of the devils are. But what's something else we can do? Do we take the initiative in reaching out? verse 10 says that Jesus came to seek and to save. Now, we know how he saved, but how did he seek? Right? How did he seek? In this story, Jesus invites himself to a meal. Now, that's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Oh, no, I don't want to impose. I don't want to put you out. Well, guess what? Sometimes it's a compliment for you to say, hey, can we hang out? Hey, I hear you make some really good, chicken tenderloin. Maybe you can invite me over sometime. When groups are down to visit us, I talk a lot about a study that is mentioned in the book CrossCultural Servanthood. And it's a study that it basically talks about and it researches how and why people are successful in overseas jobs. Now, that's not the survey wasn't done for ministry; it wasn't done for missionaries. But I think there's a lot of principles that are certainly relevant to missions. And it said that far and away the most powerful factor in overseas effectiveness was the ability to initiate and sustain interpersonal relationships with the local people. Now think about that. They're not saying that overseas success, let's say that Google sends you to Africa or your IT company sends you to China or whatever, or let's say you're drilling wells in Africa. To a large degree, your success isn't how well you know how to do what you're doing. Obviously, that's important. But your success will come in how well you're able to relate to those local people that you're working with. And if they perceive you as knowledgeable but a jerk, you're probably not going to get much accomplished, right? But if you're able to initiate relationships and also to sustain them, they're two different skill sets, right? You'll probably have more success. Now, I would like to propose that perhaps it's not only overseas, that perhaps our effectiveness in reaching out is very much tied to the same two concepts. How good are we at initiating relationships? And how good are we at sustaining them? Now, all the introverts here, are saying, well, I'm an introvert. You're not talking to me. Well, the Great Commission, Jesus didn't say, go into all the world and preach the gospel, except for you introverts out there. Don't give me that. We had a team meeting with Hope Community before you all went. I don't know if some of you might remember that. Some of you parents were there. And at that meeting, even before we went, we talked about the most significant and meaningful times that people have on a short-term missions trip isn't necessarily the work that they do, although that's meaningful, but it's the relationships that they establish. Once again, the question, we know how Jesus saved, but how did he seek? We know that Jesus did short-term ministry trips with his disciples to Tyre and Sidon. He went through Samaria. These are cross-cultural, cross-religious experiences, right? We know that Jesus sent his disciples, 12 of them, and then 72 of them, to towns and villages around Judea to spread the good news of the kingdom. I wonder what kind of training he gave them. Jesus spoke in the temple and the synagogues of the area in very public group settings, and he taught on the hillsides. But the way he sought people, perhaps more than any other, if we look at the weight of the Gospels, was around the dinner table, breaking bread and fish with his disciples on a beach, breaking bread and fish with 4,000 and 5,000 people on a hillside. So perhaps That would be a great strategy for all of us, right? As we seek to reach out, not only the people that can invite us back, says Jesus, but the people that can't. The people that not only we enjoy being with, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, but also the people that perhaps would be a stretch for us. I remember hearing Pat Kate, former head of Christar, say years ago that 95% of the Muslim and the Indian gas station owners that, by the way, are growing, have you noticed, have never been invited to a Christian family's home. What a great opportunity, right? Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the example that you gave us when you took on flesh and became a human being, and a God that was really a lot more radical than maybe we expected, and a God that maybe is a lot more radical than we're comfortable with, but somebody who has given us an example of how to express love and how to share your good news to people that need you. I pray that you would give us lives full of grace, that you would help us edge out of our comfort zones, that you would give us the desire to be like you. In your name, amen.